ArchiveXojo is a tool to store all of your Xojo code. If you have pre-existing Xojo projects, one generally would like to import all of that existing code into ArchiveXojo. Subsequent changes, either new code or modified code, would enter the ArchiveXojo via a text file, Xojo info. There are therefore two ways to enter data into the ArchiveXojo. The first being to take a pre-existing project and save it as what Xojo calls a Xojo project instead of the default binary file. This saves the content of the project as a multitude of plain text files. Create a folder and give it some memorable name and place it in a convenient location, and then save your Xojo project into that folder. You then direct ArchiveXojo to that folder and import it. Let's look at this method. The ArchiveXojo database is new and has never before been used, so it's empty. We have 3 Xojo sessions opened, Bareboat SP, List TA, and Practice, that we're going to go ahead and save as Xojo projects. We'll save them each into its own folder, and ArchiveXojo will be capable of looking through those folders and finding all the code contained there. We're going to go ahead and save those folders on the desktop for convenience. Return to ArchiveXojo and select Import Entire Xojo Project menu item and navigate to the 3 folders that we just created. All the code from those projects will end up in the database. You will notice that if I try and import the folder a second time, that ArchiveXojo is smart enough not to simply re-import identical content. Now that you have a large number of code listings in the database, we can experiment with finding specific records. Under the View menu, you can choose Code Listings, and this window will show up. There are 8 columns of information about each record. The first shows the date of the last modification, which for these mass imports will simply be the date that the code was imported. The next column is the name of the project. The third and the 8th columns show alternate ways of showing the name of the code listing. This is not completely straightforward with Xojo. The short name is often sufficient to label a piece of code, but sometimes not very specific. Sometimes the path name is more valuable. The next column shows whether the code of any particular version has changed since the previous version. If 2 pieces of code are absolutely identical, they don't get imported at all. But if there's a change in a comment, the second version will be imported, but the code will be described as being unchanged. The next 2 columns simply give an estimation of the size of the particular code listing by counting the characters of code and the characters of comment. Finally, code listings are categorized as being a method or an event or a computed property, etc. Searching for specific records is done using the filters in this upper bar area. There is an indicator here of how powerful the present filter is. It records the rows that meet the criteria and the percentage of the total. By filling in some of the text boxes here or checking off various buttons, you narrow down the number of records being displayed. Working from left to right, we can see a pop-up here to restrict the records to any particular project. If we restrict it to the list TA, now we see only 95 displayed versions, 3% of the total. The method type tends to be the bits of code that are most likely to be reusable in other projects. If we click on that, the number of displayed versions is further decreased. You'll note when you check off a restriction that you don't have to do anything further. You simply wait for an interval of time and the filtration takes place. The little orange dot indicates that the program is thinking. The next region allows you to narrow down the listing on the basis of the name. The name of the code listing in Xojo is not completely black and white. We have two columns, the short name and the path name, available for searching. You can specify searching one or the other by checking off the path name checkbox. If I put win in the search area, I can see that I have 3 hits, 3 list TA code snippets that start with the string win. If I use path name, it actually expands to a larger list because there's so many instances where the path name starts with the letters WIN. I'll go ahead and clear that, and I'll come back to any project, so we're now looking at the full listing. Here is an option to specify code listings purely on the basis of their content. If you enter one string in the content region, then you'll given us opportunity to enter a second string to force the search results to be more specific. I'll go ahead and enter the string radius, and I now have reduced the number of displayed rows to 116. If I further add another string, OR, I'll restrict the number of versions to 108. These tools are useful for finding some code when you don't actually know the short name or the path name. Now, OR is a fairly common string. If I surround it with spaces, the search becomes more specific because it'll be considered a word, and only records that have OR as a word will be shown, or if we've now reduced the selection to 49. If I exclude the comment, then situations where these strings occur only in a comment are not counted, and we can see that the displayed versions is now down to 35. The checkbox one line forces the search to require that these two strings be actually on the same line of code, and now we've reduced the number of records that meet that criteria to only 2. Out here in the date range, you can further restrict things by specifying what date the code was entered into the database. This listing is all well and good, but how do I actually see the code? You double-click on any row to see its content. This will show 2 presentations of the code listing. The one on the left is the original, with all of the comments in place. The one on the right is purely the code with all of the comments stripped out. One thing that you can do is search for some string within these code windows. Enter the string in the search field here and click on the Go button to see the words highlighted in orange. If I go ahead and enter OR, I now see all the instances of the OR in the windows. If I reduce that search and make it more specific by putting a space before the OR and a space afterwards, I will now see only the instances where OR appears as an independent word. Now, there are small buttons atop the text area that allow you to capture their content and either place them on the clipboard or create a text file on the desktop. So if I click on this button here, and if you can see on the desktop that this text file has appeared, and I can look at it and see that that text file contains the code here. If you click on this button, then the text file will contain only the code without any of the comments in place. We'll go ahead now and look quickly at some of the other functions available in ArchiveXojo. Under the Report menu, there's a single choice, which is character, words, and lines. And here you can go and get an estimation of how big the various Xojo projects are. This tells you how many characters, how many words, and how many lines when you include the comments or with the code only. If I go to a bigger project, we can see large numbers of characters, words, and lines in that particular project. The Delete menu allows you to choose listings that you want removed from the database. It's not terribly important actually to do this because ArchiveXojo is capable of storing huge numbers of code listings, so there's no real imperative to get rid of old ones. But there may be some reason why an individual prefers to do so, and the tools to do this are provided under this menu. In this window, I can make a selection of various listings, perhaps after narrowing them down with the search filter area, and simply remove them from the database altogether. The Export menu allows you to take content from the database and export it as a text file. That might be useful for reference or for pasting into other projects. Now, in general, within ArchiveXojo, whenever you're looking at some code, you're given an option to export that code listing as a text file. So now I'm looking at one individual bit of code, and I have this export button here. If I click it, then the text file shows up here on the desktop. But there are instances where you might wish to export more than one file at a time, and that's what this window is for. I can select several code snippets here and export them all as a group. If I click on this Export Simple Text Files, a folder gets created, and that folder will contain those bits of code in separate files. An alternative way is to take that same code and export it as a single document. If I do that, the code will appear here as a single document with a primitive table of contents. To actually go find the various pieces of code in this larger document, you can select this text from the table of contents and copy it into the find window of your text editor and go ahead and look for it. And now you're at that part of the document where this particular piece of code exists. Now you'll notice that when we did these exports, a window will show up explaining where the file is going to go. These windows will self-dismiss over time. You can see there's a counter here counting down, and then the alert disappears. If you need more time to read the content here, you can click on this countdown and give yourself more time. If you want to dismiss it right away, you just hit on the Done button here. The purpose of this is to give you a chance to repeat a function several times without having to always go and hit the Done button when you want to move on to the next step. You can continue to work with this window in place, and the program will continue to function. If I go ahead and decide, well, I'm going to export a large number of text files as single documents, I can choose a few here, say export, choose a few more, export, choose some more, export, and you'll notice that I'm not wasting time actually hitting the Done button. I'm simply proceeding with the task at hand. And eventually, these windows will all disappear when the counter reaches 0. Another export that is possible is what is called a snapshot, and that will export all of the code as a text file from a particular project. So you choose the project from this pop-up and then go ahead and create a snapshot. By default, this will be the status of the project in the current time. So we go ahead and create a snapshot here, and if we look in this folder, we can see a text file that contains all of the code in this particular project. Occasionally, you might be interested in preserving the status of the code in that project at some other period of time, and you can adjust these dates to do that. You could do something exotic like creating a text file for the current time and then a second file for the code as it existed a month ago, and then taking a difference engine to compare these two text files and document what changes had occurred in that last month. Finally, we'll take a look at the miscellaneous menu where there's a menu item called User Preference. This allows you to set up various preferences for your use of ArchiveXojo. I'll draw your attention to one of these, which is the Update section. ArchiveXojo has help files that are available under the orange question marks that appear on many windows. As a developer, I have reason to update these help files every now and then, and this provides a mechanism for the users to upgrade their own systems with the latest version of the help. I can send out an updated help file and users can import them from this location. An example of these help files is one that you can see right here. If you click on the orange question mark, an explanation of the specific window will appear. Now we have seen how to import an entire Xojo project. This would normally be done when first starting the use of ArchiveXojo to deal with the task of importing specific pre-existing project. The usual method of importing content is done with the other menu items seen here. Import code from Xojo text file. The normal mechanism and ongoing mechanism of bringing content into this database is done via this text file. The text file is created in the course of developing your Xojo code. It is this mechanism that allows you to accumulate the versions of all of your code, each one stamped with a particular time that the code was actually developed or modified. We can see this in action by actually going out and modifying or developing code within a Xojo project. So let's go ahead and do that. First, we'll go ahead and find some random snippet of code and simply modify it several times. When you finish some modification, you fire off a specific IDE script. The script is called Grab and Append. When I click on this, a new file will appear on the desktop, and it's actually a folder called Xojo Archive Data, and it's inside that folder that we can see the Xojo info text file. And if I look at that, I can see that it contains this single entry and some metadata about that entry. If I modify this again and go back to the IDE script, you can see that if we look at that file, it's now bigger and has the old version that we saved earlier and the new version now. We'll change that again. And when you look at the IDE script, you can see that there's a keyboard shortcut that has been assigned it, in this case, Control G. So normally you would simply be hitting the Control G keyboard shortcut and firing off that script. Every time I modify code and I'm preparing to leave this window or I'm going to run that code to test it, I would normally go ahead and hit the Control G to send a copy to that text file. Now we'll go ahead here and actually write a new method. And this is a method to calculate the area of a circle. So we'll call that area circle. And the parameters are radius, and the return type will be a double. Now we can go ahead and write this code. I'm going to include a couple of mistakes, which is not hard for me. Now I think you can see that this isn't going to work very well, but we might think that it's ready to be saved and tested, so I'll go ahead and make a copy of this. And you can see that one thing happens is that this gets reformatted. I'm using a script provided by Jeremy Cowger to do this, and it's an advantage to make all of your code have a uniform formatting before it goes into the ArchiveXojo database, because it makes comparisons easier to make. So once I've established that this isn't working well, I can start modifying this code. I'll go ahead and change this to a capital P because I like that better, and I'll go ahead and save that. But that's not really going to be the problem at hand. First of all, I haven't assigned this any value, so we'll go ahead and assign it the value of pi. And we can see here that we need to make the radius squared for this to be accurate. We'll again save that. When we test it, we can see that it still doesn't work. I'm returning area rather than A, so we'll change this to area. Save it. And now it will work, but I'll go on. I don't really like this pi being misspelled, so correct that. Again, copy that. So what we've done in this artificial example is create many versions of this particular piece of code. And if we look at the text file here, we can see the initial changes we've made, changing the value of this digit, and now all the versions of this area circle code that we've migrated through. Now this is readable here, but not very accessible. And what we would want to do at this point is bring this text file into the ArchiveXojo database. And we do that by going to the Add menu and saying Import Code from the Xojo info text file. And I'll navigate to that file, choose it, and say Open. It gives me an opportunity to leave a note about this code that I just added. I'm going to say yes to that. Here's all the bits of code that are going to be imported. And I'm going to say, in this way, one can really segment progress on your work by importing after any subtask is coming to completion. I'll say done to that. And it tells me that 7 new code versions have been added to the database. If I go and look, I'll see them on top because these things are sorted by default in reverse chronologic order. So here are these 5 versions of the area code method and a few changes here in the push button that we created. What I'm going to do now is look at this bit of code here. And I'll see now that there's a button here which is called Compare Versions, and that there are 5 versions that I can look at. If I click on that, a new window appears, and it shows that code as the more recent version on right and the older version on the left. This is version 4, and this is version 5. If I hit the prior button here, I can look at version 3, prior still version 2. Here, it's always the more recent is on the right, but I could go look at the prior, so now I'm looking at version 2 and 4, 2 and 3. I click on that, I'm looking at versions 1 and 2. I'll click here, I'm looking at the newest version, and I'll click here, I'm looking at the adjacent version, which is version 4. When you quickly look at this, it can be hard to see what actually is different. There's a little indicator here of how much the program thinks the code has changed. If I click on that, it actually outlines or rather highlights the lines that are different. If I go to a prior listing and click, so I'm comparing version 3 and version 4, I can see that these 2 lines have changed. Now this is a relatively primitive diff engine, but it usually suffices to identify what you're looking for, which is where is this code changed between this version and another version. If you want a more sophisticated look, you can use a third-party diff engine. I've set this up to try and make this relatively simple by having these clipboard buttons here. If I go ahead and do that as an example, I'm going to fire up Kaleidoscope, which is a good difference engine. And we'll come here and we'll put this on the clipboard, go back to Kaleidoscope, and say paste a new comparison. So it takes that code and pastes it on the left side of the comparison window. We'll go back to ArchiveXojo and put the right side on the clipboard, and then back to Kaleidoscope and say paste to comparison. And now Kaleidoscope will show the differences between these two pieces of code with the outlining used in that program, which is more sophisticated. This video provides a short introduction to the usage of ArchiveXojo. I encourage you to give it a try, and I think if you work with it for a while, you'll find it can help you with various problems that occur during development. The manual and help files hidden behind the orange question marks provide a deeper dive into the functionality of the program. Thank you for your attention.